right?
Yes,
Sorry.
yeah.
Okay. Yes, I'm going to talk about Colin Wilson, and the name of the talk is Beyond the Robot, and that, quite incidentally, is also the name of my book about Colin Wilson that this talk is based on, Beyond the Robot, Life and Work of Colin Wilson. And I'm assuming people know who he is, otherwise you wouldn't have come here, or you're taking a gamble. Or you may have heard his name or something like that. So I don't, necessarily a raise of hands, but most people sort of conversant to some degree with who he is and all that. Good, because then you're going to hear a lot of stuff you know already. Colin Wilson is a Leicester lad. He was born in 1931. He died in 2013. He was 82. He wrote an enormous amount about a very, very wide range of subjects. He wrote well over 100 books. It's depending on your criteria for what constitutes a book or just a pamphlet or something like that, but certainly well over 100, somewhere between 150 and 200, I guess. And he wrote about, as I said, a wide range of things. He was a novelist. He wrote science fiction, he wrote fantasy, he wrote crime and erotica. He wrote autobiographical novels, but he also wrote about philosophy and psychology, literature, criminology, the occult, parapsychology, mysticism, religion, music, and even a book about wine, which he liked a great deal. It's called The Book of Booze, but it's mostly about wine. And actually, some time ago when I was in sort of wine country in France for a spell, I had that book with me, and it was a great help in understanding what the labels meant at the time. He's lectured around the world. Towards the end of his career, or I don't know, the 90s, I think, maybe early 2000s or so, he narrated a series called The Flood that was on, I don't know what it was on in the States, maybe the History Channel. I think some parts of it are still available on YouTube, but it had him going to sacred sites around the world. But he had already lectured in many places, including behind the Soviet, the Iron Curtain back in the day, and many, many places in Europe. His books are translated into dozens of languages. In the 70s, he was a TV presenter on a program called Step in the Dark, which was sort of like a paranormal sort of show. I don't know if it was regional, if it was just sort of Cornwall or Devon down where he lived, or whether he got up into the Midlands or anywhere else, but I know he was on that. And unfortunately, he was never accepted by the mainstream literary establishment or the press. As I'll get on to, he had initial success, meteoric, as they say. I never quite understand the idea of a meteoric rise, because meteors fall. If you know that phrase, he had a meteoric rise, and you think, well, actually, they come down. So I don't quite know. I'm just changing my other glasses so I can read my notes. What that means, but I guess he would have had that. He had a sensational overnight success. First up to bat, his first book, which we'll get around to. But then after that, he was sort of persona non grata. He's kind of a black sheep or a pariah in the English literary establishment. And this even continued on until his death. When he died in December of 2013, everybody had to write an obituary, so The Guardian and The Observer and The Telegraph and all that, but there was a particularly scurrilous piece in The Independent by someone named Terence Blacker, and it was so heinous that I publicly challenged him to a duel over social media, and this was picked up, and he backed down. And he actually retracted the piece, and he published a apology. So stand up, for that which is important to you. And where am I? Where's the? Oh, there we go. Okay. As we get on to, I first became aware of Colin Wilson's work many, many years ago when I was a musician. But I met him as a fan in 1981. He was giving a talk, this is January 1981, he was giving a talk in a bookshop, used to be on Regent Street, called the Village Bookshop. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but I was a yank over from the States on holiday, and this was a fantastic bookshop, and they had a village press as well. They republished a lot of things by Wilson, a lot of other writers. And he was
good
giving a talk
music,
there.
and very good music in there.
As well. There you go. And but then in 1983, I went on what I call a mini search for the miraculous. And this was when I was living in Los Angeles, but I went to Europe and I went to places like Glastonbury and Chartres Cathedral. And I also found the site of Gurdjieff's Institute for Harmonious Development of Man in Fontainebleau outside of Paris and things like that. But one of the places I did go as well was I made a pilgrimage down to Cornwall, where Wilson had lived since about 1957 in a little place called Gordon Haven, which is next to the metropolis of Mevagissey. So Mevagissey's small, Gordon Haven is quite small. Well, at the time when he was there, practically nobody was living there. I mean, now it's all built up. Yeah, I made a trip down there, and I spent a day with him and an evening talking about his work, and we spent an evening drinking wine, and he was explaining his ideas about consciousness to me. I got them that evening. In the morning when I woke up, they were a bit fuzzy. But when I went to sleep that night, I'm pretty sure I nailed them. And then we carried on with correspondence and more or less a friendship, I guess. I mean, he had many other people who were admirers of his work who visited him. But that was something that was a regular occurrence. Now where he was living, everybody would turn up out of nowhere, and he had many different people coming and staying with him. But that's how I wound up knowing him until he died in 2013, writing a book about him. And at the same time, my publisher in the States, Penguin, they put out a reissue of his first book, The Outsider. And this very strange thing, you probably know The Outsider, but you can't see it. I don't know how to hook it up to the computer, but on my way here I had to stop at Waitrose and just to get something. And when I was waiting in the queue to buy something, I looked over, and what did I see on Vogue magazine? But so right there on the magazine rack, peeping out of Vogue magazine, was just the two words, The Outsider. I didn't pull it back to see what that article was about, but I took that as a sign that this was a good thing to happen today. And it's the kind of synchronicity that Wilson himself would have loved and would have written about. And I will indeed fit it in, because that's the next thing I'm writing a book about synchronicities and precognitive dreams and things of that sort. And also, he was very kind to provide a foreword to a book of mine that talks about his work, but also in the context of other people's, like Rudolf Steiner and Madame Blavatsky and Ouspensky and a lot of other philosophers of consciousness in the same kind of genre that he was in. But the problem with Colin, or the problem that he seemed to face, was that, as I said, he wrote a lot about a lot of different things. And unless you're an obsessive like myself, who tracked down every book of his and read them and reread them many times, you might not get the idea that there's one fundamental theme or some fundamental themes that inform all of the different works. You might get okay, well, he's written lots about crime, so he's one of these true crime writers, or he's written science fiction, or he's written some stuff about the occult, and so on and so on. But you get the impression that he kind of jumps around and, whatever seems, whatever he's getting paid to write about at the time, as some critics have accused him of. But there are some fundamental themes. And I'm going to try to do this today, this afternoon, is take you sort of walk through his life or his work, a selection of some of the many books he wrote, but also try to tie them into some basic themes. And in it was 2014, maybe a bit later than that, but there was a memorial for Colin at St. James Piccadilly, which you probably know is a site. There's a lot of alternative thinkers, Rupert Sheldrake and people around in that kind of milieu give talks there, and so on and so on. And there was a memorial service for him, at which people who knew him were asked, to say a few words. And I was asked in 5 minutes to say something about his ideas and all that. And to be asked to say in 5 minutes with someone that just spent their lifetime trying to do was a heavy edit and with a very, very quick deadline. So I had to sort of focus it down, concentrate it, distill it to what would be kind of the thing that would fundamentally what he was kind of working at. And as often has happened in my career as a writer and commenter on these sorts of things, I mean, Colin himself came to the rescue, because in the beginning of the first book of his that I read, we'll get on to, is a book called The Occult that came out in 1971, and it sort of was kind of his second big success. He was kind of back in the best-selling lists for a time after that. In the beginning of it, he says, there's one obsessional theme that runs throughout all of my writing, and he calls it the paradoxical nature of freedom. And this is sort of the answer to the question, well, when you make the statement, you also make that there's something wrong with human consciousness. And so the question is, well, what? What is wrong with human consciousness? And he would encapsulate that. The answer to that question would be encapsulated in this notion of the paradoxical nature of freedom. What is the paradoxical nature of freedom? It's the idea that if our freedom is threatened, and in place of freedom you can put any central value of your life. I mean real values, not your car or your latest downloads, but some real value, something that permeates your whole life and gives your whole life value and meaning and purpose, and fills you with the vitality and the will to live. When that's threatened, you know exactly what it is. You know how important it is, and you do anything to protect it. It suddenly becomes the most important thing. Colin was very fond of quotation from Dr. Johnson, who said that the knowledge that one will be hanged in a fortnight concentrates the mind wonderfully. All right, so got the gallows up there. If you know you're going to die in 2 weeks, suddenly a lot of trivia gets blown away. I mean, this is something that's kind of the punchline of quite a few novels and stories. Suddenly, whoever it is, you're faced with sudden death, and this is a theme, a trope, we might say, that Colin finds in lots of different writers and comes back to, this confrontation with death, or this confrontation with sudden annihilation, and its power to, suddenly isn't quite the right word, but it immediately turn on this illumination about the value of life. So if you know you're going to be hanged in a fortnight, suddenly your mind goes like this, and a lot of stuff that's useless gets blown away. Well, that's the opposite, or that's the same thing of when your freedom is threatened. But when we have the freedom, we don't know what to do with it. This is one of the problems. This is one of the main themes in modern literature, the existential kind of crisis, where you have different characters who have the kind of freedom that most of us have today. I mean, we're all pretty much free. I mean, you're here today. You don't have to be somewhere else. Most of us are fairly well off and all that. I'm not saying, people are poor and that doesn't happen, but generally we're pretty well off. And but we tend to take for granted these values. We tend to take for granted the things that give our lives meaning when they're not threatened. When we get used to them, and we all sort of think we know what that means. But it's a strange phenomenon. What does it mean to get used to something? When you've listened to Beethoven's Jupiter Symphony the 27th time, it just suddenly isn't as good as it was the 14th time, or the second. But it hasn't changed in any way. It's exactly the same piece of music. It's exactly the work of genius it ever was. And if someone else was just discovering it, they would be ecstatic. But something has happened in my mind, in our mind, when we get used to something. And we take things for granted. And this is the strange kind of insight that Colin was finding in different writers. Jean-Paul Sartre, who's one of the great philosophers of freedom, he said that he never felt as free when he was in danger of being arrested by the Gestapo during the occupation of Paris. Why is it that many people who lived during that time often look back to the Blitz as the best time of their life? I mean, the bleeding bombs are coming down over their heads, buildings are falling down, there's no food, you have to go down in the underground. There's such a nostalgia or something about that time. Somehow the crisis, the confrontation with death fundamentally, energizes your life, and you feel free and alive and all that sort of thing. But once that threat goes away, we get used to it, and we take it for granted. And we often get in situations where we feel like, oh, this is so boring. Everything is so horribly boring. But why is that going on? This is sort of the question that Colin addressed. And he first addressed it in this book, The Outsider, who Vogue magazine was publicizing on my way here. And it came out in 1956. It's never been out of print. It was a surprise bestseller, which we'll get on to. But it's about the nature of sickness in, I can't read it from here, something, mankind in mid-20th century. You know, it's not your usual summer reading. It was about things like angst and alienation, and it was about this strange philosophy that was coming over from the continent, from the French, called Existentialism. They're over there with their berets and smoking galois. And you know, we don't want any of that stuff, but it was coming over in the 50s. And Wilson was the first or the only homegrown British existentialist. People like Iris Murdoch, she wrote about existentialism, there were some other, but he was sort of the real thing. And these are all pictures from him from around that time. That's the famous photo of him sleeping on Hampstead Heath. There was a period of about 6 months in somewhere end of 54 where Colin was working by day, writing his first novel called Ritual in the Dark, which I'll get on to, at the old reading room in the British Museum, while he was sleeping up on Hampstead Heath in a waterproof sleeping bag. And he was doing that because he didn't want to spend money on a room, and also because he couldn't make the child maintenance payments to his first wife. He admits to that in his autobiography. That was one of the motivations as well. But when he up to writing The Outsider, he left school 16 or 17 or something like that. Had a stint in the RAF, but then got kicked out of it. He pretended to be gay to get kicked out of it, so he got kicked out. It wouldn't happen, wouldn't work today, but it did back then. And then he went from job to job to job. He would take all these different day jobs, day laborer, navvy, or he worked as a clerk, or he worked as a hospital porter, he worked on a farm, he delivered milk, anything to get enough that he needed. And as soon as the boredom crept in, as soon as that sense of life becoming mechanical, of him losing this kind of sense of vitality, he would leave the job. And he hitchhiked throughout England in his early days, over to France and all that. And he knew he was a genius. Some people agree with him, not everyone. Certainly the first wave of critics did, but then they changed their minds. Because he said it too often, and certainly among the Brits, you're not supposed to say that sort of thing. You're supposed to keep that to yourself. So I won't declare my own genius this evening. I'll keep that to myself. But what happened is that he was right. He was right. And these are all different shots from this time. This is the duffel-coated bedsit, post-war, pre-Beatles, 1950s. The coffee bars, the milk bars, and all that sort of thing. And that's his girlfriend at the time, Joy. They subsequently got married and lived together, forever. She's his widow. She survives him. That's in Notting Hill. They had a room, and in a big. It was like not quite a squat, but it was a big sort of apartment building where lots of other artists and writers and ladies of the night, or whatever their hours were, lived as well, and all that. And this is some pose shots when. He was famous for the turtleneck sweater and the glasses and all that. And the other thing was that he was totally working class. He had no, he left school again, 17 or something like that. He had no academic background, no university degree, but he knew everything. He had read everything. He had spent the previous 10 years leading up to the publication of The Outsider, reading everything he possibly could about everybody. And he got a bit of it in there, in The Outsider. And again, it was a strange overnight success. The critics were tripping over themselves to say how wonderful it was. People like Cyril Connolly, who was one of the great literary doyens of the day, Philip Toynbee, J.B. Priestley, Edith Sitwell. There was one review said, he's a genius, and at 24. And this started what some of the press started to refer to as the sort of messiahs of the milk bars. And the publishers were trying to find even younger people. There was a friend of Wilson's, a fellow named Stuart Holroyd, and I think he was 22. I can't remember her name now, but there was a teenage girl novelist who wrote something. She was 17. I think that was it. She had the one book. But again, it was this kind of like, let's get them while they're young. And in a way, Wilson came into success at the same time as people like Elvis Presley and early rock and roll. And this worked against him because what happened was that he got caught up in what was known as the angry young men, which is kind of punks, of literary punks of the 1950s. So people like Kingsley Amis and John Osborne would look back in anger, and John Brain or Alan Sillitoe. There was a couple angry young women in there, Doris Lessing, but she wasn't as young as though she was a bit older. I think she was 10 years older. And Iris Murdoch wasn't quite, but she was around the same time. But they were sort of the equivalent of the Beat generation over in the States, but they weren't as scruffy, and they weren't as wild, and they weren't as extravagant as the Beats. They were kind of buttoned down Beats, as it were. They were more socially conscious, except for Colin. He wasn't about that. Colin was writing about existentialism. He was writing about religious issues. He was writing about the meaning of life, purpose, consciousness. Why are we here? And they're all writing about, various forms of Marxism or pink, Marxism. But Kenneth Tynan, who was the famous theater reviewer, went on to be a film reviewer and all that. And it was fashionable to be Marxist. It was fashionable, kind of, I think, to be sort of like a Jeremy Corbyn character today. Back then, sort of, I would say he's kind of reflecting some of the kind of political sensibilities that did. But I'm not here to talk about politics. But what happened is that the journalists they got sick and tired of hearing every day about these young geniuses and the angry young men, and they got tired of hearing about it. And it was kind of like, it wasn't the writer's fault, it was the journalist's fault in the first place, because they made a lot of paparazzi journalistic hay out of them. And they went everywhere, and they tried to get things going. There were fistfights and, sort of wild events and things of that sort. It made for good press. But then after a while, and the British public is very fickle, they like to raise you up, and they like to knock you down at the same time. And so the angry young men en masse became a target, but Colin in particular, because he was the most pretentious of them, because he was writing about what's the meaning of life. He was writing about questions, and Colin writes about this time in one of his last books called The Angry Years. And it's a very acid kind of book, and if you like the kind of literary sort of history where the one guy left standing gets to talk about all the other ones, that's what he does there. So everybody gets it who he didn't like, and he waited. But it's very politely, but he goes into Kingsley Amis and John Osborne, and he shows, just lets us know exactly why he stayed alive and they didn't. But he was asking questions about things like this: ultimate yes or ultimate no. Meaning, do we say yes to life, or do we say no to it? And this came to him fundamentally because he wondered why so many artists and poets and writers and musicians and philosophers in the 19th century either committed suicide, died young, went insane, became very ill, or something happened. I mean, Keats, Shelley, Byron, Nietzsche went mad. He was one of the healthy ones. Maupassant, Ibsen, Baudelaire. I mean, you can name lots and lots of the greats from the 19th century, certainly from the Romantic kind of school. And and we have this whole idea of, they died young, and this romanticism about, Liebestod, and the whole romanticism about death, and there's nothing that the youth likes to think about more than death. And that's something that carried on to early rock and roll. There's all songs about that as well. But Wilson just wondered, because these romantics, they had this sudden vision of ecstasy. They had this sudden vision of life as being infinitely meaningful. It just was there, the horizons reaching out forever, endlessly, in all directions. And they would go into these heights, these ecstatic heights, and then bang, they come back down to earth. And the strong ones survive this, and they transform themselves, people like Goethe and Blake and Beethoven. But then the others didn't have that same brute strength that those characters had. And these sudden shifts from this vision of meaning and this ecstasy and the reality of poetry and beauty and all that, and then back to the grim world of you know, the grand grind world of Dickens, or the world of, you know, the 19th century, the rise of capitalism and commercialism and all of that utilitarianism. They're smack dab in this kind of mechanical, dead world, and the dissonance between those two, Wilson says, undermined them. You know, they didn't feel strong enough, and they came to disbelieve the vision of ecstasy. It was kind of an illusion. It wasn't real. It wasn't really, they didn't have, and as the title of one of his books is, they didn't have the strength to dream. They didn't have the strength to maintain the dream in some way. And he believed in that vision of affirmation. He believed in that vision of meaning. He had had it himself at different times, and he believed that it was true. So is there a way? Is there a way to have that vision without it crushing you? Without it making you unfit for life, which is what happens to many of the romantics. He often refers to Thomas Mann's novel Buddenbrooks, and the main character, Hanno Buddenbrooks, just gushes about going to hear Wagner and all this kind of thing, and it's this wonderful, transformative, ecstatic experience, but the next day he can't bring himself to go to work. He can't bring himself to go do what he has to do. And so somehow, yes, it's giving you this tremendous sense of meaning, but it's making you unfit for everyday life. But is that necessity? And so, in this book, The Outsider, Colin charts this character, a kind of character identikit of a certain type of person that's becoming more and more prevalent in the modern age. And it's fundamentally, the outsider for Colin is not just a beatnik, and it's not just a misfit, and it's not just, you know, someone who's an antisocial character. It's a character, someone who has a craving for a sense of meaning and purpose that the modern world can't provide anymore. The modern secular materialist world is geared towards making things comfortable, having a higher standard of living. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that, as we'll see. I mean, this is what civilization does. It makes things easier. It civilizes things. But somehow along the way, it has not found a place for these type of people. And he also wrote, I mean, pretty much everybody in the book are men, but he did write a brief sort of pamphlet about the female outsider. So just to let you know, he was very well aware of that. And he actually was supposed to be a chapter in this book, but he did get around to putting it in. These are characters that have just a tremendous hunger for a kind of meaning and purpose that the secular world can't provide. They could have found a place for themselves in the Middle Ages, he said, in monasteries and things of that sort. And because the church was strong then, and it provided a sense of meaning, and it provided a kind of target for their spiritual hunger. But in the modern world, it doesn't exist. And so they can't find a place for themselves. But they see through the world. They see through the everyday, regular world that we all agree on, and kind of, we agree to keep it going because it makes things easier for us. So they see through the falseness of our everyday lives. And the outsider sees too deep and too much, and what he sees is chaos. Behind this facade of everydayness and order and rationality, it's getting very porous these days. I think if you pay attention to the news, there's less dissonance between our sense of things being utter confusion and chaos, and oh no, actually everything's, you know, okay, well ordered. I mean, back again, this is down in the 50s, so the kind of world that we find every day now is not the same world that they saw. And I have these three figures here because, I mean, I have to say, he talks about many different people: H.G. Wells, Tolstoy, Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, lots of different writers and thinkers. All come under his kind of spectral analysis about, you know, the outsider's challenge. But there's three in particular I'm going to refer to here because this triumvirate turns up in another of his books. And we have here T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, you know, Peter O'Toole, and we've got Van Gogh, who I think was Kirk Douglas, right? Didn't he play Van Gogh? Yeah. Lust for Life. And Nijinsky, I can't remember the actor's name, but there was an actor in a film in the 80s, Nijinsky, but he only made one movie, so I don't think he went on. But that's the mind, that's the emotions, and that's the body. And each of these outsiders were powerfully developed in that one side of themselves. So T.E. Lawrence had a powerful intellect. And this is what eventually led him to see through the lies and illusions of the British government following World War I and their relationships with the Arab states and all that. And he got so sick of the hypocrisy of that world that he quit his position. He was so sick of the celebrity he had as T. Lawrence that he committed a kind of slow suicide, but he re-enlisted in the RAF as a private with a different name and all this kind of thing to avoid this hypocritical world that he had found himself in. And he saw through things too deep, too clearly for him to be able to accept life. And he didn't out and out, commit suicide, but he sort of committed what Colin called a kind of mind suicide or slow suicide. Van Gogh, we know, incredibly powerful emotions. He was someone who was torn back and forth between these waves of utter affirmation, if you know the sunflower, or the trees, these visions of nature, things that are on fire, and they're full of enormous vitality, like Blake's paintings or something like that. And then he has the crows, the darkness. He shifts from these tremendous senses of affirmation, ultimate yes to ultimate no, and eventually he does commit suicide. But he wasn't particularly articulate, although he did write lots of letters. But the emotions were his sort of developed power, and he lacked similar control and balance with the mind and the body. And then lastly, we had Nijinsky, who, if you ever get a chance, Nijinsky's diary is one of the most poignant, piercing spiritual documents of the last century. I mean, it's absolutely a remarkable account by a fantastically sensitive soul to the world around him. But he was considered a child by people like Diaghilev, who's the great maestro of the Ballet Russe, and Stravinsky and others around him. His wife more or less considered him a child as well. And he was uncontrollable in his emotions at times. So when he danced, he was a god. And he said, when I dance, I feel fire in the head. God is fire in the head. And fire in the head came to him when he danced. And there's all those accounts that he was able to suspend himself in midair in these kind of leaps. I don't know if it's true or not, but there's accounts that he was able to sort of levitate, or he hovered in the air. He didn't just go up and down. But each of these different characters, these different outsiders, are not whole. And this is a general problem for all of us. We're fractured. We're not whole beings. You can find this this goes back to Plato. You can find it in people like Gurdjieff. You find it in Jung. You find it in Steiner. You find it the same kind of theme. Body, mind, emotions. They're separate sorts of operations that need to be blended together and that kind of thing. And that's one of the themes of the outsider. And there's many, many themes, but the outsider fundamentally has to discover who he truly is, or who she truly is, and not to get over feeling like a misfit in society. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're anti-social, you're anti-authoritarian, but you are able to maintain a sense of the values that are important to you. And it's your job to bring into the world. The outsider feels like a misfit first, and then he comes back, or she comes back into the world with the bearer of new values. Because they're the pseudopodia of the next stage of consciousness, pushing through this dense, resistant material, which is us. And they push through, and they become sensitive to new things. And it's their job to articulate these new kind of values, and then add to the culture as a whole. And just to point out the cultural impact of Wilson's The Outsider, he was one of the first ones to write about Hermann Hesse, and this is before the big Hermann Hesse revival, the posthumous revival, when he became a best-selling author in English translations in the 60s and early 70s. Nobody was really talking about Hesse. Nobody really read him at all. I don't think many of his books were translated into English at the time. And also, Wilson was one of the first ones to write about Gurdjieff, outside of the sort of Gurdjieff community. Again, Outsider came out in 56, Gurdjieff died in 49. Uspensky's book came out that year. Beelzebub's Tales, I think, came out in 50. And then there were people that were part of the Gurdjieff circle that started to publish books as well. But Wilson was one of the first ones outside of that circle to write about it. And it's at the end of the book, and Gurdjieff's ideas will inform Wilson throughout his career. He's one of these people he has a conversation with throughout. H.G. Wells is another one. And there's other, his two bête noirs are Samuel Beckett and Sartre. He's absolutely livid about Samuel Beckett. If if you're a fan of Waiting for Godot or anything like that, don't read Wilson about it, because he just thinks this is utter rubbish. And this guy, he's got the Nobel Prize for Literature. It's just the world's gone mad. And Sartre. He has more respect for Sartre, although he disagrees with Sartre. He has more respect for him than Sartre. What he likes about Sartre, he likes about Wells, is that they're using their mind to try and understand their experience. They're applying their mind not to abstract questions about epistemology or the nature of mathematics. They say, what does this mean? I mean, Wells is actually an existentialist, so he's not really part of the existential school, but the way his later novels, when he was past all the science fiction stuff, and he was writing all the stuff about what should we do with our lives, how should we live, he was addressing the existential question, because that's the existential question. We find ourselves here, we have no idea how we got here, what are we supposed to do now that we are? And religion used to answer that question, but no one answers that question anymore, and hardly anyone asks it, because you're considered jejune, or childish if you ask that kind of question. So what? There you go. What happened in following the outsider is that Colin's second book, Religion and the Rebel, where he looks at a possible religious answer to the outsider's dilemma. He himself considered entering a monastery for a while, but he couldn't give up sex. Sex was something that is essential. Sex and crime are these kind of sub-themes throughout, and they often come together in his work. And he writes about sex a lot. He really wasn't interested in drugs. Any drug he really liked was wine. And he was very critical of the psychedelic movement and all that kind of stuff. But sex for him was a way, immediate way of altering consciousness, and I'm sure you agree. But he considered the possibility of a religious answer to the outsider's dilemma, and he writes about people like Swedenborg and William Law and Jakob Boehme and others like that. But the book got completely panned. The critics were sick of this angry young man at that point, and it was slaughtered. You couldn't find a good review of it anywhere, really. And his publisher, Victor Gollancz, suggested that he stop writing for a while and try to get an academic job somewhere teaching. Iris Murdoch approached him at a party once and said, if you'd like to go to university, I can arrange for you to get whatever scholarships and that kind of thing. And then T.S. Eliot even told him that he thought what he needed to do is get a job in publishing, don't write for the 10 years, and slowly build up. And Wilson said, screw that. So what he did was, I tell a story in the book, I can't go into it now, but there was all this scandal around him. There was all this scandal. Famously, he was living with Joy over in Notting Hill, and her parents disagreed, and they came down. His father had a horsewhip, and he was trying to whip him, and the paparazzis got there. It was in all the papers. It was the Sunday Mail. It was, the Express and all that kind of stuff. So finally, he got tired of all that stuff, and that's when they hightailed it down.
News of the World.
News of the World, all those kind of places. They hightailed it down to Cornwall. And I mentioned, we were just talking about the triumvirate, the body, mind, and emotions, and Nijinsky, Lawrence, and Van Gogh. That same kind of tripartite kind of system of human psychology types turns up in his first novel, this Ritual in the Dark, he was writing this when he was sleeping up in Hampstead Heath, and he was cycling down from the Heath, down through Kentish Town Road, and then finally down to Bloomsbury to the British Museum, and the old reading room, it's not there anymore. The old reading room. People like Bernard Shaw and Karl Marx and Wells and Ruskin and others had worked there as well. And he was writing this novel. And it's fundamentally the brothers Karamazov meet Jack the Ripper in post-war East End. So the sex theme, it's the idea that, and he's not, let me just say, in the States I'd have to probably say trigger word, so people don't get upset because I'm going to talk about something that could possibly be slightly upsetting. It's like on the news, it contains images that some viewers might find disturbing. Well, they damn well want them to find disturbing, because that's why they show them, so that they'll stay and watch the news some more. But in any case, no, he explores the idea of kind of sex crime as a curdled way of achieving a kind of intensity of consciousness. It's kind of this urge for this intensity of consciousness gone bad. And just like, you can drink very fine wine, or you can drink Sterno. And they both have alcohol in them. The one is a very delicate, poetic way of achieving the kind of effect from the alcohol, and the other thing is that it'll take the polish off the wall. It's absolutely raw, but it fundamentally is trying to appease the same appetite. And so he explores that idea as this kind of this drive towards a more positive, intense form of consciousness going kind of curdled and going wrong. And three characters based on the body, mind, and emotions are in the ritual and dark. And it's a great London book. The book that usually gets trotted out in the summer when tourists come is his book Adrift in Soho, which is a nice, it's a fun read about his years in bedsit, duffel-coated Soho in the late 50s. And it's very much about that time and place and all that. But this one's all over London, and he's cycling all over London. And he's in Camden Town, and he's in the East End, and he's in Hampstead, and he's on Fleet Street, and it goes all over the place. And I tried to get Penguin here to publish it as a Penguin classic, because it certainly deserves to be one. But they're not having it because they're still subject to they're still Wilson phobic, as it were, as we tend to say these days. And so he also wrote Encyclopedia. He was one of the earliest sort of true crime writers too, because he found the psychology of crime fascinating. He didn't find the crimes fascinating. He thought this was, lurid and vivid evidence of human stupidity. But what drives people? What's the psychology going on? What's the psychology behind? And he, in many ways, found similar things, because the murder is like the ultimate negation of the value of life. But he said, we ourselves in our everyday lives, we negate it as well. We devalue it as well. It's only when we're faced with the reality of something like murder, when we read some of these accounts, that our own grip on the importance of our own life suddenly comes back up. That's precisely why we like to watch and see disturbing things on the news. Not because we're fetishists for that kind of thing, or a taste for violence and all that, because unconsciously it makes us go like that a little bit. And Wilson's saying, as I said, this sense that we take everything for granted. So in a certain sense, it's not an ultimate distinction between the murderer and us. It's a gradient. And we devalue our own lives in a slow pattern of living complacent existences where we take everything for granted. And that's different in style, but not in ultimate content than the kind of murderer's more sudden and abrupt devaluation. And then he takes this whole idea of the outsider through a series of books that sadly nobody paid attention to, except one American psychologist I'll get up to. But I'll just briefly go through this. It's a thing somebody calls the outsider cycle. There's one called The Age of Defeat, and this is about the loss of the hero in modern literature. And he developed something he calls the Fallacy Insignificance, where in modern literature we assume that there aren't any happy endings, there are no heroes anymore, life is meaningless, it's crude, it's banal, it's the kitchen sink mentality that was associated a great deal with the milieu that he came out of, the angry young men. If you know those early late 50s, 1960s black and white films, Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, and Loneliness of Long Distance Runner, it's just kind of cinema verite, it's this kitchen sink school. Life is very banal, and the artist is obliged to show it in all its grim boringness. And he said this was a kind of rot that was working away at human consciousness. And we were becoming indoctrinated into this notion that we're all failures, or life is ultimately unsatisfying. Well, the only thing we can really look forward to in some way is kind of creature comfort and physical pleasures, and we all get along. We can all have a nice little world together here in this banal kind of existence. And in Strength of the Dream, he analyzes the way in which different writers use the imagination, how they use imagination to understand reality. And this is one of the books where he was ahead of the pack. It's most known today because of its section on the horror writer H.P. Lovecraft, who was someone else that Colin was writing about before he became very, very popular. I don't know if you know Lovecraft, but there's like a whole industry around Lovecraft's books and all that. And so just quickly go through a little behind here. Other books in this cycle: Origin of the Sexual Impulse, this fundamentally, he's trying to understand the impact of the forbidden. What is the attraction on forbidden? And he sees sexual perversions, which I don't think we use that language these days anymore. I don't know, choices? I don't know what's the non-microaggressive term I can use to talk about these kinds of things. I don't quite know. Transgressions, they are kind of a spice added to our sexual lives, which temporarily give it a certain intensity. But fundamentally, it's not about the sex, it's about enhancing our grip on reality. And so fundamentally, he shows how these things are unsuccessful, but they do shed a light on human psychology. Beyond the Outsider, he's finally getting beyond that at that point, after about 6 books. And this is where he takes an outsider's analysis of contemporary biology at the time. And he's talking about this notion of transhumanism, which is something that's very popular today. It's all about the man-machine merger and cyborgs and that. But the term originally started with Julian Huxley, who was the brother of Aldous Huxley, who lived up in Hampstead. And Wilson talks about it in this book. And it's more or less an existential critique of Darwinian biology and the notion that it's all chance and random mutations and things of that sort. There's an active force behind life. Wilson was a great fan of Bernard Shaw. And if you know Bernard Shaw's plays, he has this idea of the life force. If you know Man and Superman. This whole notion, there's this kind of vital, purposive urge behind life. It's not mechanical, it's not the survival of the fittest, it's not the pressures of the environment. There's something inside life itself that is pushing out, as I said, this pseudopodia from the other dimension that we have hints of every now and then. I had on my way here when I got the synchronicity about the outsider. And then he put it all together in this a book called Introduction to New Existentialism. So what was wrong with the old existentialism? We have Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Sartre, and Camus. It had reached the cul-de-sac, it had reached a dead end. Existentialism starts out, we can say, with a good head of steam, because it's questioning the scientific rationality that has come to be the defining criteria for human life at that time. And in Kierkegaard's case, more particularly the Hegelian kind of system, where every little thing in life is part of this grand movement of thought, and every tiny thing has its place, and it's all moving towards this wonderful denouement. And Kierkegaard's saying, but hold on, what about me? I have a toothache. I'm here in Copenhagen, I need to know how to get on in life, and I'm completely gobsmacked by Hegel's system, but it doesn't help me at all. And Kierkegaard said, Hegel's system, all these kinds of systems, the rational kind of system of life, everything is in its order and all that. It's like a map given to him to find his way around, in which Copenhagen is about that small. So it's like, oh, you need to find your way around? Well, here's the globe. It's on there somewhere. But he's saying, what about the immediate questions of life? And these are the questions that religion used to ask. And this is why, and he was completely, the Christianity of his time, this kind of lukewarm Protestant Christianity, because everything was okay and all that sort of thing. He talks about the leap of faith. You want to have a true Christian belief, which is a dangerous thing. You have to believe in absurd things, the reincarnation, the resurrection of the body, and all this kind of stuff, where the Christianity of his time didn't really talk about that kind of stuff. It was too easy. And Heidegger's thing was that we've forgotten being. We suffer from forgetfulness of being. And we live in inauthenticity. We live inauthentic lives. The one thing that can make us remember being and live authentically briefly would be a vivid grasp of the unavoidable reality of our death. We are all going to die. We're subject to radical finitude, which means that's it, folks. And it's by focusing on that, focusing on being towards death, we can dissolve this fog of inauthenticity around us and lead true lives. And in this, Heidegger and Gurdjieff are not too far apart, because Gurdjieff said the same thing. Gurdjieff said we're all asleep. We've forgotten our being. We have no sense of our being. And the one thing we needed to do is to have an organ put into our heads that would remind us of our death, that we don't have time to waste anymore. If we all remembered Dr. Johnson's insight about the value of knowing you're going to be hanged in a fortnight, that would be the same thing. We would be living in the full sense of being again. And Sartre picks up from that, but Heidegger, although he's atheist, doesn't believe in God, he still has there's some mystical sense of being. There is a kind of something more than everyday life in the background. And in his later books, he writes about poetry and language. And you might not understand exactly what he's talking about, but you get in a kind of mood when you read Heidegger. And you kind of feel, oh, that tree, it really exists in some way. And you feel connected to some deeper kind of thing. Sartre doesn't have anything of that. The world is this sticky, pasty thing that he wants to get away from. It's this, if you know his novel Nausea. The character in Nausea wakes up to being, but he wants to escape from being, and he realizes he can't escape from being. The existential position for human beings is that existence precedes essence. With most things, essence precedes existence. You're all sitting in the chairs. There was a reason for the chair to exist before it existed. You are the reason for the chair to exist. You're sitting on it. What's my reason to exist? What's your reason to exist? Religion used to give us those answers, but by this time, it doesn't work anymore. And Sartre, the world is absolutely meaningless. And we're confronted every day by making these radical choices about our lives. The full weight of moral and ethical reality weighs upon us every day, making the choices we make. And if you've read any of his novels, and it isn't easy. Things aren't good. You know the play No Exit. You know, hell is other people. Well, Simone de Beauvoir often said hell is Sartre. But, I mean, there's that sense. And he says that man is a useless passion at the end of his vast tract, Being and Nothingness. And it's meaningless that we live and meaningless that we die. So it's unavoidable. And the best we can do, and this is why he drifted over to radical leftist politics, the best we could do is sort of, undermine the bourgeois world, which he hated vehemently. And a good deal of his philosophy is based on his hatred of the bourgeoisie. And this is one of the things Colin picked out in his analysis. And finally, you have Camus. Again, he talks about the absurd. He's more lyrical, he's more poetic than Sartre. He isn't a metaphysician in the same kind of way. He doesn't write this huge metaphysical tract like Being Nothingness. He writes essays as a moralist, more in the sense of Montaigne or someone like that. And he has more of a sense, he isn't afraid of the natural world. He actually talks about sunlight and the senses and things of that sort. But still, we have to, his famous book, The Myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus is the Greek character who pushes the rock all the way up to the top and then rolls back down. And the Greeks had a talent for futility, for images of futility. Tantalus is another one, Penelope, all that kind of, they have a real talent for doing that. And we have to imagine Sisyphus happy, though, somehow. And Camus, here and there, does have these kind of mystical, somewhat mystical-like experiences turn up in his writing, but Wilson tells a story when he met Camus in the late 50s, when there was a French edition of Religion of the Rebels supposed to be coming out. And they had a conversation, and he wouldn't admit to it. He said, no, there's nothing like that in my writing. The French, most of them don't admit to that kind of stuff, but it's there. Anyway, and it reached a dead end. The old existentialism reached a dead end. Its analysis of the inauthenticity of our lives was laudable and needed, but it couldn't offer a positive kind of answer to what should you do instead. There's a famous story of Sartre when he gave this rousing speech once at the Sorbonne about freedom, and some students came up to him afterward and said, well, what should we do with our freedom? He said, do whatever you want. So it's like kind of a big letdown. You're absolutely free, but there's no guide or criteria for you to direct, to help you direct your freedom in any direction. There's no clear goals to that. But Wilson, because he accepted the evidence of mystical experiences, he accepted the evidence from different states of consciousness, he thought that, no, there was something. There was something, it isn't God up in the sky, and it isn't, some notion of, progress or something like that. It's within our own consciousness. Within our own consciousness, within our own being, we're the agents of that sense of meaning and purpose. It doesn't come from out there. It can be drawn out from us by things out in the world, but we actually are the ones that are in control of it. And the three kind of ingredients, I'm going to go a little bit longer this one and then maybe do it quicker this second. Is this okay? This is supposed to be broken up into two. Or I can do the whole 2 hours straight on and then we can have questions after that. But okay. This fellow is Abraham Maslow. He's an American psychologist. He's known as the father of humanistic psychology. He read Wilson's book, The Age of Defeat, and he was impressed by it because it talked about the same thing that he was talking about, the loss of the hero. Maslow has something he calls the Jonah complex, where most people run away from their destiny. They run away from the creative potentials that they have. They run away from their door impossibilities because it'll make them stand out from the crowd. Jonah, in the Bible, tried to escape his destiny as a prophet, and God chased him down pretty much everywhere he went. And Maslow always told the story where he had his classes where he would say, which one among you believes that you're going to go on and do, very good work? You're going to do exceptional work in your careers, and nobody raised their hand. And he said, well, if not you, who? The people next door in the other class? Or, your neighbors? Why not you? Why do you assume that you're not going to? And this is the same sort of fallacy of insignificance that Wilson was writing about, as exemplified in The Loss of the Hero in modern literature. And Maslow had this very important notion for Wilson called the peak experience. And these were abrupt, sort of out of the blue moments of joy and well-being, and just basically all is good, that would come to people out of nowhere. There's a famous one where there's a mother who's preparing breakfast for her children off to work, and children off to school, and her husband off to work, and all that, and it's all very hectic, but she suddenly looks over and she says, aren't I incredibly lucky? And there's a famous story where a Marine is on an island for, 2 years, and he hasn't seen a woman in that time, and he goes to another base, and there's a nurse there, and he sees one, and he's struck by the realization that women are different than men. You see these things new. The content is the same as everyday experience, but you are seeing it for the first time without the kind of presuppositions and the assumptions that build up like silt on our consciousness. And we're not even aware of them anymore. So it's like a dirty windscreen. You kind of see through it, oh yeah, that looks nice, and suddenly somebody cleans the screen and think, wow, it's sort of like that. That's the peak experience, it happens. And Maslow said that you can't make them happen. They're a collateral benefit of other things going on. They come and go. Wilson wasn't so sure about that. He thought, why can't we come up with a technique to actually make them happen? And that's when he turned to this gentleman up there, Edmund Husserl, who is a German philosopher, and he's the founder of the school known as Phenomenology, which is a mouthful, but it's basically, it's the study of how things appear to us. It's a study of the contents of our consciousness. Phenomenology is basically a descriptive study of what we are conscious of. Don't tell me what it is, tell me how it appears to you. So, okay, I'm looking at this, and if I was going to do a proper phenomenological analysis, I wouldn't say it's a glass, because that's already assuming. I would have to describe the surface, contours and all this kind of thing. It sounds boring, but it is, the resolute pursuit of the obvious leading to radical astonishment. That's how I see it. If you resolutely pursue something that you think you know already, veils will drop, and you start to see this thing in a new way. And this is the same thing Kathleen Rain, who I've written about, the great Blake scholar and poet, elsewhere. She says, the imagination doesn't see different things, it sees things differently. So the content of mystical experience is always the same, and the semantic content is, of course. And people write long books unpacking what they said of course about. But that's what it fundamentally is. You remember something, you've seen something, oh my God! And this is something that happens to quite a few of Wilson's outsiders. And the reason Husserl is important is that his fundamental insight is that perception is intentional. We tend to think that when we open our eyes, the world's already there, and we're mirrors just reflecting what's out there. And this goes back to Descartes, and it's the fundamental kind of scientific view of how the mind works. I have my eyes, and there's a world out there. My mind doesn't have anything to do with how that world is, other than reflect it back. And Husserl saying, no, your eyes aren't mirrors or cameras. They're hands reaching out into the world, or they're arrows. You shoot an arrow at it. But I like the idea of a hand because it not only hits the target, it shapes and molds things. Right now, unconsciously, at a level that we are not aware of, our consciousness is shaping the world that we see around us. I'm not saying it makes out of nothing. I'm not an idealist in that way. There is a real world out there, but we never see it. No, this is the old one. We never see it as it really is, because in a certain sense, it isn't. There is no really is about it. The world comes into existence through the interchange between what's out there and what's in there, and they meet together in the middle. And phenomenology is the discipline of learning how much we are putting into the world we're seeing. We open our eyes and we have assumptions about things. We don't know we have those assumptions, and we claim the world is like that. This is Wilson's critique of people like Sartre and Camus. And they start from the basic that everyday consciousness is consciousness per se. These mystical experiences don't tell us anything about it. And he's saying, well, they make those assumptions, and that's why they draw this kind of depressing, gloomy conclusion that life is meaningless. Because they're already assuming that we have to start with this kind of everyday, banal, bog standard reality. And, but Husserl's saying, no, we reach out. There is perceptions and also a will to perceive. We have a will to perceive things. We're not aware of it. It's down below. It's in the unconscious, the subconscious, whatever you want to call it. We can't voluntarily do that. Although, ultimately, Wilson will say, the more conscious intention we put into our experience, the more we are there in it, the more we can become aware of this intentionality, the more we can become aware of the active nature of our perceptions. They're not just reflections of things. And, you know, Steiner says this, other people say something, Goethe says this, Blake says this, many other people say the same sort of thing. Wilson's coming at it with this discipline of phenomenology. And the fellow at the bottom is Alfred North Whitehead, famous philosopher, and he, his contribution at this point was he recognized that human beings have sort of two modes of perception, and he called this immediacy perception and meaning perception. Immediacy perception gives you like just the flat surface of things, what's in front of your face basically, and it's how we tend to see the world most of the time. Because in order for us to be as successful in navigating the world, and we're the most successful creature on the planet, I know there's quite a deal of question about what our success has led to, but let's put that aside for the moment. Put it this way, we're in a position to wreck the planet because we've been so successful. And the reason we're so successful is that we're able to filter out from the great mass of stimuli and sense data around us, even in this room, just what is important to us. Just what we need to know for utilitarian purposes. Just what we need to know in order to navigate and get around through the world. But occasionally, we perceive the world in this other way, what he calls meaning perception. And the other perception tends to break things up into bits and pieces, the better to manipulate them by, said the big bad wolf. But the other perception, meaning perception, connects things. It's relational. It doesn't have the sharp focus of the immediacy perception, but it has a broader, fuzzy, kind of total global way of seeing things. And the moments of poetry, you know, we see a sunset and it's beautiful. I mean, why do we think a sunset's beautiful? Really, it's just electromagnetic wavelengths of different sort of frequencies. We just happen to see it as red or whatever it is, but it's not really there, science tells us. What's really there is the wavelengths. Oh, Whitehead's saying no. What's really there is that beautiful sunset, and you are perceiving it through this other mode of perception, the meaning perception. And so Wilson takes these ideas and creates a kind of foundation for what he called his new existentialism. But his own fundamental kind of insight into this is what he calls the indifference threshold. I think I've just got a couple more and then we can take a break. And that's Harold Lloyd from one of his films. And the other character is Graham Greene. And Wilson tells the story of when Graham Greene, who wrote about it in one of his essays, when he was a teenager, he was so bored, he was absolutely bored to tears. He was so bored to tears, completely bored. He was really bored. He was so bored. I sound like Trump, but he was really bored. And he rummaging around in his brother's kind of things, he found a revolver. And he has an essay called The Revolver in the Corner Cupboard. And he took the revolver and he loaded it. I guess it was easier to get, you know, weapons and ammunition back then. But he took it, he put one bullet in the chamber, one of the chambers, and spun it. And he took it up to Berkhamsted Common. And he was going to play Russian roulette. He had read about Russian roulette, you know, somewhere or saw a film or something like that. So here's this bored teenager, Graham Greene, nothing better to do. Oh, let's go see if I'll blow my brains out or not. So he goes up to Berkhamsted Common, takes the gun, goes like that, and Colin did this in all of his talks. Goes like that, and goes like that. The hammer comes down, nothing happens, it's empty. And from being absolutely, totally bored, so bored that the only interesting thing he could think of was to maybe I'll blow my brains out or not, suddenly he said, everything opened up. And he saw infinite possibilities. spreading out in all directions around him. And it was like light bulbs had gone on where he didn't even know, there were lights. And he went from, nothing could have interested him at all to suddenly he had this amazing sense of meaning and purpose, and everything became totally interesting. So what had happened? Did the world change? No. Something happened to Graham Greene. And what happened is that in his mind, he went like that somehow. Involuntarily, the possibility he was going to blow his brains out made him do that. And so Wilson came up with this notion that we have this, what he calls this indifference threshold, where before Graham Greene had done that, if you said to him, well, you've just won the, Kentucky Derby, or you've just, whatever it is, you've just won the lottery, and who cares, I'm so bored, nothing of a positive character, nothing that was good would have altered his mood. And we don't know it's like that. We're in some horrible mood, and friends try to cheer up us, and we tell them to go take a hike, and everything's horrible around us, nothing is good, we don't like anything. And so Graham Greene's in that mood, and nothing anybody does is going to change it. But the opposite, the sudden threat and possibility of the loss, not only of your freedom, but your life, made him involuntarily go like that. And that going like that, according to Wilson, temporarily increased his intentionality. Suddenly, some part of his mind that is in charge of the intentionality got the message saying, oh my God, this is important. And then, turned on the juice. Put the pedal down to the metal, and suddenly he's flooded with the intentionality, which is like a flashlight. It's like a light directed at the world. It's like something cleaning the dirty windshield. What's out there hasn't changed. You just suddenly see it better, and you see what's there, and you see the reality of things, and you see that there are infinite possibilities. The world, we live in the midst of an infinitely interesting world, and we only know that a few times in our lives. Sadly, we get to recognize that it is that as we start heading towards the door. And this is why Bernard Shaw said we all need to live to be about 300. Because it's only when we're about 80, 85 that we start to realize what life is about anyway, and that we're too old to do anything about it. And so, if we had that vision of the intensity of meaning, of the reality of meaning, then Wilson, one of his novels called Philosopher's Stone, he takes the idea that, well, if we could maintain that vision, we could possibly extend our lives. And he had a fascination with long livers, and I did as well. People like Shaw, like 95, John Cooper Powys, the novelist, 91, composer Sibelius, I think he was 92, Albert Hoffman, the discoverer of LSD, I think it was 101, Jacques Barzin, one of the great American historians, I think he lived about 107. He just died a few years ago. In any case, so Wilson believes that a kind of frequent experience of that kind of intensity consciousness could possibly lead to longevity, but that's another project. I haven't got the funding for that. But this whole notion of crisis and inconvenience, this is the paradoxical nature of freedom. We only appreciate it when it's threatened. And civilization is based on the premise of let's get rid of the threats, right? We live in houses, so we're not subject to the vagaries of nature. There's no wild animals around anymore. There's no marauding bands, anymore, that kind of thing. All these kinds of things, if you look back in history, we live in ways that the kings of old couldn't even begin to dream of. When you think about it. If you consider anybody, they had jewelry and stuff like that, but they didn't have, what's up? Or they didn't have the internet, or they didn't have computers. We have access to powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal man, as they used to say of Superman. But the kings of old didn't even have that. So, what's wrong with us? Something happens to us. All this civilization tends to, and some people doesn't bother them, but in these outsider types, these vital individuals who have a raging appetite for more life, for life more abundant, as it says in the Gospels. They can't find any outlet for it in this world. And they also are subject to this indifference threshold. All the good things don't help them. This is why they put themselves into uncomfortable positions. Live dangerously, Nietzsche tells us. Build your houses on Vesuvius. That's one of my favorite ones. Nietzsche himself was actually a rather timid character. But he was never at home in the world, and he traveled around Europe all the time in search of good weather. He was extremely sensitive to weather. And actually, Nietzsche was one of the most miserable people who ever lived. He was the loneliest guy on the world at that time. He was ill health all the time. And he developed this philosophy of yay-saying, of life affirmation. And he came up with one of the weirdest ideas ever, the eternal recurrence. Not that you were reincarnated into a different life. Your exact same life happens absolutely identically as to what took place the last time. So we've all been here before. I warned you at the beginning you're going to hear something you've heard already. So we are all here. We've been in this room before, and we'll be in this room again a million times over. And those whose vitality and who have had the moments of ecstasy that Nietzsche talks about, when he talks about pure will without the confusions of intellect, the storm and this Dionysian overflowing of energy. If you have experienced that, you will say yes to life. You will say encore. Because I've experienced this tremendous moment of affirmation. Those who don't experience, they find the idea of recurrence a kind of hell. It's understandable, I mean, Nietzsche's, the poet, he's writing in a particular way. I don't know how much we're supposed to take him literally. But he realized that the soft, comfortable life, it creates a kind of spiritual decay. In the same way as Wilson says that sweet, soft food causes tooth decay. If you live a life completely everything taken care of by the state or whoever, there's no challenges, there's no rough edges, you tend to turn into this kind of non-life. You lose the life that you lose the life that you have. Well, I'll get on to T.S. Eliot saying that. So Nietzsche recognized instinctively that somehow danger in some way can revive. But again, this is the paradox of it, because we create civilization not to have the danger. So we created a civilization, and the most vital minds in it want to get away from it. They want to throw themselves back into some difficult situation because they feel more alive in that kind of thing. And that fuels a lot of our back to nature kind of sensibility and off the grid or all that kind of thing. Yes, it's a kind of political statement, but it also, embracing those sort of limitations makes you feel more alive in a certain way. But can we do it without having to give up all the good things of civilization? Dostoevsky knew what it meant to be a moment away from death. Because when he was a young man, he was arrested with a group of others for engaging in radical politics. This is the time of the Tsar. And they were set to be executed in Semyonofsky Square. And they're all in a row and ready to be shot. And at the last minute, there was a reprieve. And Dostoevsky said one of his colleagues went insane. The tension, from being about to be shot to being was too much for him. And Dostoevsky himself says that before it actually happened, like on the way, before the reprieve came through, he had this sudden sense of like, everything is good. All is good. I wasted my time. I wasted my time with all these trivial preoccupations, all these complaints and mumblings and grumblings about life. And this comes through in his novels. He says very controversial things. There's an exchange in his novel The Devils between two of the main characters, where there's one character named Kirillov who wants to prove his freedom. Eventually, he proves his freedom by committing suicide, because it's the one absolute free act that he can make, but let's not go there. But he is subject to these sudden illuminations as well. And he talks about how all is good, and the other character says, well, even the torture of an innocent child. He says, yes, even that, all is good in some way. Not literally that it's good to go torture children, but in some way which we can't understand now in our everyday sense of consciousness. There's a vision of affirmation. There's a vision of ultimate kind of benevolence and redemption. And it doesn't necessarily have to be Christian, although Dostoevsky writes about it in that context, which redeems everything. We can't comprehend that in our logical mind, how something that we recognize as absolutely evil can in some way be redeemed. But in this subconscious upwelling of the sense of vitality that the confrontation with danger brings, that everything seems to be good. And I had Wittgenstein in there mostly because he read the Brothers Karamazov 12 times. And that's very dangerous in the first place, I think. But Wittgenstein is a philosopher, but he gave away his inheritance. He didn't use any of the money he had. He gave it away to everybody. He gave the poets who needed it. And he did strange things, like go live in a hut in the darkest wilds of Scandinavia. He buried himself, I don't mean literally, but metaphorically, in a teaching in a sort of backwater of Austria and this kind of thing. He was a brilliant, philosopher, but he recognized that somehow the comfortable life would be a spiritual death. And so why is this the case? Finally, we're getting around to why this is called Beyond the Robot. The problem isn't civilization, and we've struggled to create civilization for very good reasons. The problem is something that Wilson calls the robot. And this is an evolutionary, labor-saving device that does its job too well. It does its job too well. What's a robot? Okay, remember when you learned how to ride a bike? And you kept falling off, and you couldn't, then one day you got on, and you could ride it? But if you thought about it, you might fall off again? Well, you, verbal, everyday, conscious you, learned how to ride the bike, you learned how to take the steps and motions at a certain time, and then you passed all that information on to this automatic pilot in you that's called the robot. And then the robot is riding the bike, actual physical manipulations. You get to think about where you're going to go on the bike, right? When you type, when I learned how to type, every letter cost a great deal of effort. I had to pay attention, focus on each letter with the two fingers to get it done. Over time, I, up here, am no longer doing the typing. My hands are sort of doing it. Not as good as they could, but every now and then I have to intercede. But still, I can think about what I want to type, right? So we pass on actions and operations that initially we learn with a great deal of conscious effort to another part of ourselves that does it automatically. Why is that good? Because it frees us up to do other things. I'm not too self-conscious about giving this talk because I'm kind of familiar with the material, so I'm not thinking about it too consciously. I'm able to just kind of flow. Obviously now I've screwed myself and I'm going to start forgetting what I want to say. This is the story, the famous story of the centipede, right? And the centipede and the ant asks the centipede, "Hey mate, how do you get around with all those legs?" And he says, "Easy, it's like this." And he can't do it. Because all along he's never bothered thinking about it, he just did it. But now he is, so that part of him that did that is all well and good, but once the conscious mind interferes, it starts to, and we know how it is when we get self-conscious. You can do any number of things you do quite easily and fluidly, but if something makes you self-conscious, they stop. The fluidity is gone. So the reason I have Eliot there is Eliot has a line from his poem, The Rock. He says, "Where is the life we have lost in living?" Well, the robots lived it for us. Wilson joked that, again, I said, why is it that when we listen to the Mozart Symphony the 29th time, it's not as interesting? Like, you're not listening to it, the robot's listening to it. Wilson even joked, I guess much to the chagrin of his wife, that I often found him making love to my wife. So all these sorts of things, the robot starts to do them for us. And what happens, because we're not aware this is happening, we're not aware of the mechanics of our own consciousness, is it gradually, it just takes over. It's not a villain. It hasn't wrested control from us. But we more or less say, oh yeah, you could do that. Nothing's, but what happens with a crisis or some inconvenience, Wilson came to this recognition when he had to hitchhike up to, I forget where it was, to Peterborough or somewhere like that, to see his girlfriend's family. And he didn't really want to go, but there was no reason for him to stay in London. And he was in this really kind of, I couldn't care, less whether what happened. But he finally got around to hitchhiking, up there. And he wasn't getting any rides, and then finally he got a ride, and that didn't even cheer him up. But he got in the lorry, and they started going, and then he started hearing a knocking sound from the engine. And the lorry driver, and he said, oh Jesus, God, that too, my God. And so the lorry driver said, sorry mate, I have to pull in and take care of this. So he let Wilson out. And so then he gets another ride. So even that didn't cheer him up. So he got a second ride. He should have been feeling like, okay, at least. But then strangely enough, the same kind of knocking noise starts in the second lorry. And he thought, gee, I can't believe this. I gotta get out and I have to do it. I don't even want to go to Peterborough. Oh man, I'm just going back to London. But then the driver said, hold on mate, I think if we keep it at this speed, we can keep going. And the driver said, you keep your ears open if you hear the knocking noise starting. And I'll keep, So what Wilson found himself after a while was he was absolutely engaged in listening to that knocking noise. And he suddenly, when the driver said, "Yeah, I think we're going to make it, mate," he was ecstatic. "Yeah, we're going to get to Peterborough." And he realized nothing good that had happened to him all that day had caused him to change his mood. It was this inconvenience, this something that he had to focus his energy on, and he went like that. And then he realized he called it the St. Neots margin, because it was a part somewhere up towards the Midlands where it happened. I don't know exactly where it is, but the more generic term is what he calls the indifference threshold. So he had pushed himself past this indifference threshold. And why did he push himself past it? That he had to focus, very acutely on the sound coming out of the engine, and then he was very happy to get someplace that an hour earlier he didn't want to go to at all. So William James is there. He's the great American psychologist, because he wrote a lot about the phenomenon of second wind, where athletes, they push, they're completely tanked out, they can't go anymore, and they push themselves just a little bit more, and then suddenly, the petrol tank opens up, and they got much more energy. And there's an essay of his called The Energies of Men, where he talks about different cases where people have pushed themselves, past, remarkable extents and extremities. There's, I forget the colonel's name, but there was a colonel in India during the Sepoy Mutiny who had to hold this one town or this one outpost against the mutiny, and he was the only sort of officer there, and he lived on opium and brandy for like 3 days or something, and manned the whole thing. And we have all this energy and power, but we don't know that we have it, and we don't know consciously how to access it. We access it involuntarily, in crisis, inconvenience in some way, gets through to us. And James says that we live subject to limitation by degrees of fatigue which we have come only from habit to obey. We've got used to these limits of ourselves, and so that's it. But if you push past them, you open up into whole other areas of energy. This is what James called the bullying treatment back then when he was a psychologist. And you would have what they were called the neurasthenic patients who refused to make any kind of effort. And you had to bully them into doing something. And they put up a big fight, but once they actually did it, this other tank of energy clicked in. And again, this is something that Goethe sort of did. He created artificial conditions which to push people past their limits. They didn't know they had them, and he forced them to go past their limits, and suddenly we had this influx of energy in more way. So this was going to be the halfway point, this point, but we're at 3:30 already. So outside is driven by hunger for purpose and meaning that the modern world can't provide. He must accept himself for what he is, not a misfit, but an agent of the next stage of human evolution. He must reject the fallacy of insignificance. He seeks out danger instinctively as a means of intensifying consciousness. He must find a way to free himself from the robot. He must develop a way of strengthening his intentionality. So this is where Wilson found himself at the end of writing about the outsider. And then the next part of his career is all about, there's a way of turning off the robot without putting a gun to our head. So it's 3:30 now. I'm sorry this went on. This was only supposed to go on to about 3. I've got another, 10 slides or so. I don't have to go through all of them. We can stop now and have questions. The next part, this is sort of the existential Wilson. The next part was more about his occult. He gets a second career in the 70s, basically. The occult comes out, this is big sort of mammoth history of the occult. This becomes a big bestseller, then other books, and he's on TV doing that.